Hello, everyone. So my name is Shivy Williams, and welcome to our session today, Accessibility Stigma, How We Overcome It with Better Emotional Awareness. Before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. This session will be recorded. Please leave your cameras and microphones muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. We will get to as many of them as we can, either during or at the end of the session. So I will introduce our presenter, Demetria Nickens. She's a mother, wife, daughter, aunt, sister, and niece. All these titles mean so much more than any credential she could ever attain. She is a certified mental health first aid instructor and trauma recovery coach, and has 9 years of experience working with students with disabilities transferring from high school to college. Mental health has always been a cornerstone of her life because she's chased the knowledge of it since she could remember. Being in the field of working with individuals with disabilities, she has grown a beautiful awareness of how she thinks about the world, emotions, and people, and how she decides to interact with all of it. That's why she named her business Dove's Inner Beauty, because now she wants to help others build emotional awareness and understanding the trauma in you. Her passions, knowledge, and experience intertwine with her presence to any audience. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Demetria Nickens.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? I hope so.
Yes.
She activated the chat, so hopefully we'll be able to chat as well in the presentation, and this can be interactive. I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully you all can see that now, and we will get started, right? So accessibility stigma, right? So I want to start with like kind of what I want to do today. I want to think about a quick overview of emotional intelligence assessment, right? So this is from my experience of having an emotional intelligence assessment done, right? So just kind of the things that I learned from that. I want to talk about accessibility stigma, right, and how it impacts our students with disabilities in higher education. And then I want to provide some practical ways to combat accessibility stigma with this idea of emotional intelligence. So really, this is really just about us having a conversation with one another today and being able to really interact and talk about and be honest with one another about how we combat and think about accessibility stigma. And so to begin, I really like to know who all is with me today, who's in the audience. If you could put in the chat if you see it, tell me a little bit about you, if you're at a school, what state you're in, and do you feel like you know more about stigma, about emotional intelligence, or you feel pretty good about your knowledge about both? So if you could put that in the chat for me and I could see them kind of roll in, that would be amazing. If you can see the chat, I know there's been some issues with that, but if you can add that information to the chat with me. That would be fabulous, just so I get a little bit about you and who I'm talking to. All right, Massachusetts, Charlotte. Nice, Charlotte. Okay, Massachusetts. I see them rolling in. Okay, Missouri. Morganton, Milwaukee. Yeah, all right. Kingston, Wilmington, Nashville. Wow. Okay. This is so cool. It's so cool. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate this so much. I appreciate it so much. Thank you. Awesome. It's so cool to kind of see where everybody is from and that you all chose to come to my presentation. So I just want to say thank you for that today. It means a lot. It means a lot to me. So when we think about emotional intelligence, right? So, how many of you have ever really taken an EI assessment? They can be a little lengthy if you've ever taken one before, right? They really do from these different domains of information. So before I get into this, I do have to say a quick disclaimer, right? I don't give emotional intelligence assessments or analyze emotional intelligence assessments, right? I do know someone that is certified to do that work. She actually presented at this conference at 2. Her name is Keisha Jones. She did a presentation on EI. And so you definitely should contact her if you're interested. She did my emotional intelligence assessment. So just as a quick disclaimer on that, I just wanted to put that out there. This is really just an analysis of my assessment and the things that I went through when I got assessed, right? So when I think about emotional assessment, right, and the concepts that went with that, um, you a lot of the things, the domains that kind of went with that were self-perception, stress management, decision making, self-expression, and interpersonal. And you get this beautiful score from all of these things, and then this total score about exactly where your EI is, right, when you do these. So when I think about accessibility stigma, the two that I'm really going to focus on today are the self-perception and the interpersonal, right? And so each one of these gets broken down into smaller segments. And so when I think about self-perception, there's self-regard, there's self-actualization, there's emotional awareness. And then in interpersonal, there's interpersonal relationships, there's empathy, and then there's that social responsibility, right? So I want to focus on, for this presentation, we're talking about accessibility stigma. I really want us to think about emotional awareness, right? Just recognizing and understanding your own emotions. You know, how often do we really sit back and think about how our emotions impact our thoughts and our actions, right? Interpersonal relationships, you know, it's about the skill of developing and maintaining mutually satisfying relationships that have trust and compassion. And then empathy, right? Recognizing, understanding, and appreciating how other people feel. And then social responsibility, willingly contributing to society and the welfare of others, showing concern for the greater community, right? So when we think about all of these concepts, right, you know, where do we lie on this scale of these things, right? Do you feel like your emotional self-awareness is high, that you're really able to recognize what your emotional awareness is? Do you have good interpersonal relationships with others? Are you able to express and have empathy? Do you have this sense of social responsibility? I would bet, because most of you came to this presentation, that the thought is that yes, that you probably are on higher on the scale of emotional intelligence for all of these things, right? But you really never know until you start to do some of that self-evaluation. And so, you know, what I want to challenge you to do is really think about this concept of that self-evaluation, because the reality is, you know, what influences how we act and function and work and relationships in life, right? We all know the answer to that, our emotions, right? Oftentimes, people assign this good and bad to emotions, but it isn't the emotion that's good or bad, right? The reality is, what is my emotion trying to tell me, right? What are my actions? What actions do I automatically assign to a specific emotion? So, for example, right, do I think about if I'm angry and my emotion is anger? A lot of people are automatically say that anger is bad, right? They automatically put this bad association with anger. But what do I do when I'm angry that tells me that anger is bad, right? So like, what do I, every time I get angry, is there an action that I put behind that anger that kind of gives me that, oh yes, anger is always bad? And so that is something that we really need to think about, how we manage our emotions and how we assign them these morals in emotions, right? And so when we think about this and we really put this concept to thought, why don't we think about our emotions when we think about overcoming stigma? We think about this idea of stigma and how we overcome it. We often don't think about our emotional awareness when we're thinking about stigma and overcoming stigma. We know that it exists. We know that it's out there. We know it's present, but we don't ever really think about this concept of how we decide to overcome it. And so that's really important, right? It's really important that we really stop and really think about what it means to really overcome stigma, right? Um, Somebody said emotions are indicators, keep them in the car with you, but they can't just drive, right? But you just can't drive, right? Right. Thank you. Absolutely. 100% agree. And so we have to really understand what our emotions are telling us. So, like, for example, when I think about these pictures that I provided here on the right side of the slide, and so these pictures are really a representation of different disabilities, right? At least that's what it's meant to be, right? When I was thinking about what I was going to put on this slide and those pictures that I would put, I saw this and I loved it, right? And I was like, yeah, this is really great representation of accessibility, right? Um, it, Honestly, when I look at it, the reality is that some of these may even be made up. I can't even say that all of these are true symbols that mean accessibility, right? Do I even know what all of these mean? But I still use this picture in my presentation as a way to depict accessibility. Was that my bias in considering accessibility and just using this picture, right? It's maybe, right? I think it's important that we ask ourselves these questions about why we do the things we do, um, how we think about when we move forward, when this idea of how do our biases, how do they contribute to um, how we think about um, this idea of stigma and this idea of accessibility. I hope that makes sense and that came together there. So when I think about, I want you to do an exercise for me. I want you to write down 3 words and don't put it in the chat, write them down on something beside you. I don't want to know what those 3 words are. These are 3 words that are for you. But I want you to write down 3 words that you've heard associated with the word disability. All right. Any 3 words that you want to use that you've heard associated with the word disability. It doesn't matter what those, because we won't know what those words are. Those words are for you. You can, no judgment zone, right? Because I don't want to know what those words are, but I want you to think about that. Just give me 3 words, any 3 words that you want to write down, and write those down and keep them and just kind of hold on to them, because they're really going to frame our discussion as we move forward here. So when you think about the words that you've written down, hopefully you've had a moment, a second to really get them written down and really thought intently about the words that you chose. So when you think about those words, if you had to categorize any of those words into stigmatizing, not stigmatizing, and maybe stigmatizing, where would you put your words? Now, here's what I would like to see. If you would put in the chat, if you had at least one of your words that was stigmatizing, and it's okay, just like say yes, right? If just one of the words that you have written down, if one of them was stigmatizing, can you be honest with me and just say yes, at least one of my words was stigmatizing, if not all 3. And like I say, you don't have to tell me what they are. Um, but was one of the words that you decided stigmatizing or not? Thank you for your honesty, those that are willing to put that in there. I appreciate it. And so when we think about this, and thank you all. When we think about the words that are stigmatizing and the words that we decided to use, we have to know that it's partly because of society and but it's really because of the stigma, right? The stigma that is out there that we don't think about, that we don't perceive, right? We have to start thinking about, what does stigma look like, right? Who is impacted by stigma? Who displays stigma, right? We all have the capacity to be stigmatizing in some way, right? It happens. It is not always intentional, but it is what it is. And so it's important that we can even recognize within ourselves that the stigma is present, right? That it can occur whenever. So I have a story, a quick story. Of course, I was on social media, and of course, I was going to find something stigmatizing on social media, right? When do you not find something stigmatizing on social media? But recently, I was on social media, and someone on social media said the other day that people are walking around as though mental illness is a badge of honor. And and then they said, wow. And I was like, what? I instantly felt some type of way with this statement, right? Because I instantly, I instantly was triggered, right? That someone would say that, oh, people shouldn't walk around as though mental illness is a badge of honor. To me, it's not about mental illness being a badge of honor. It's about no longer being able to walk in shame about your mental illness and people being willing to talk about it because it's the stigma, excuse me, it's the stigma that stops us from talking about it, right? That phrase was very stigmatizing, right? It's stigmatizing. And we have to recognize that. And so, of course, I replied back on this social media post saying that it wasn't about that, it's about people not walking in shame. That's essentially what I said. I was really nice. I didn't get ugly. I was really nice with it. But inside, I felt some type of way, right? Because the reality is that people just don't reckon they don't notice the things that they're saying that's stigmatizing a lot of times. And so we have to kind of look stigma in the face and be able to say, okay, this is something that's stigmatizing. How do I decide to move forward and not be stigmatizing moving forward, right? How do I combat that? How do I start to look at that and really make this make sense for me? So keep your 3 words. We're going to use them again. So the exercise about the 3 words and whether they're stigmatizing, not stigmatizing, and maybe stigmatizing really comes straight out of this mental health first aid activities. So mental health first aid, if you've never gone through before, I really recommend it. I think it is amazing. I'm an instructor. And that the previous activity is a variation of something that's in there. One thing that mental health first aid really teaches is this stigma of mental health, right? Mental health can be a hidden disability. And so when we think about this idea of mental health and stigma, it's a lot of stigma that surrounds it, right? And so when we think about any disability, hidden or or not, there is stigma that surrounds it. And so just as a disclaimer, I am trained in mental health first aid, and if you're interested, let me know. Just had to put that shameless plug in. Um, so let's think about Marcos. Now, Marcos is very fictional, right? Um, but I think it's important that we practice this thought, this idea, and we think about Marcos, right? So Marcos has decided to go back to school to get his associate in business administration, right? He had an IEP in high school. The diagnosis still impacts him as an adult, but doesn't want to get a plan in college. How do we support him? How would you support him? Throw it in the chat for me. We can read out some responses. Tell me how you would support Marcos in this situation. What are the things that you would do? Are the things you would say? Would you do anything? Tell me how you would respond to Marco. Would you respond? Would you say anything? I'm interested in your thoughts. We have a department on our campus with that 100% support students with IEPs. Awesome, awesome. So refer to maybe a accessibility services department on campus. Try to find out the why. I love that. I love that. Talk to him, right? Let's have a conversation. Find out the why. Offer informational support sessions as Marco's need, right? If he doesn't want disability services, then we have student success coaches and tutoring. All right, so we're gonna give him some tutoring success. Let him know of other resources on campus like academic coaching, tutoring, counseling that's open to all students. I love that. Love it. Love it. Love it. Have a conversation with him so that he can understand that all the students have some type of support. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I would share with him it's best to have and not need than to need and not have. Refer to disability services along with additional campus support services. Not just letting him know, but also what the process is. Yes, explain better to have the accommodation plan set up and not need it than need it and not have it. I love these suggestions. I love them. They're beautiful, beautiful. Not burdened in stigma. I love that. I love it. So when we think about what role does stigma play in this scenario? Um, I would second the person who asked the why. Yes. What role does stigma play in this scenario with Marco? Any ideas, any thoughts on like what role stigma plays in this scenario? The impact of it is a place where you can go that someone will know your name and you can find a friendly face. That's beautiful. And we wish that that was always the case. It makes it hard for Marcus to ask for assistance or guidance in the first place. Yes, stigma may be the reason that he does not want to get a plan in college. Yep. Assuming the past will carry the future and that will, yep. Yes, support he needs, services he needs, if too embarrassed to ask for it. Yes, 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 right, yes. Right. So, stigma stops him from getting the access he needs to be successful, right? This idea, and think about this for yourself, if this was you, did stigma stop you from encouraging him to get the assistance he would need, right? There's an article entitled Special Treatment, Stigma in Higher Education. And statistics show that like only 6% of students with an IEP in high school actually register with the disability office at their local college or university. And the reason for that is fear of stigmatization, right? So in this article here, right, it a quote from it says students with disabilities report feeling judged by their peers and their professors. They worry about standing out as different and perceive that their peers and professors either doubt their ability to perform academically or believe that they are receiving an unfair advantage if they receive academic accommodations. Despite making this highly unlikely proposed change to the law, the problem is not the law, but rather the erroneous perceptions of students and faculty, right? And so this is real, right? It's really important to understand that the stigma is real. In high school, students feel stigmatized because of grouping, which is not done in college. In high school, no need to self-disclose. Right, right. In high school, right, that grouping thing it is a can be very stigmatizing because you feel like you're taken away from everybody else and you're put all over here in this classroom with just you and other people with disabilities, and it's like, yeah, you don't get the same things, you don't learn the same things, and it can be very, depending on where you're at and what school you go to, it could be very, off-putting, right? um, Oftentimes, students think it'll show up on the transcript, right? That there's no confidentiality in college because they have to disclose what it is. It's going to follow them forever, right? There's a lot of misconceptions, right, about this idea of getting the assistant, right? And so the problem is that we don't really stop these misconceptions, right? What we don't How do we help some of these misconceptions when it comes to college? There's also something else this article talks about is that the fear of that standing out. If I've got a voice recorder, but nobody else is able to have a voice recorder, then I'm automatically outed that I have a plan, right? Things like that. I'm able to use my laptop, but nobody else in class can use a laptop, right? I'm automatically outed in class, right? So how accommodations are implemented provides this stigma for students that like, no, I don't want to do this because I'm outed in this situation, right? It automatically becomes this problem, right? I had to be honest. I need to look at it to be certain. I'm sorry. If someone asks who the author is, I need to open it to see for certain. I apologize. I don't have it off the top of my head. Um, but hopefully you guys will get access to the slides and you can actually click on it and look at it. But I can definitely check for you. Thank you for asking. Um, and so, oh, I think it's thank you. And so it's really important that we think about these things, right? And how it's really impacting our students. Oftentimes in our at our colleges, we are so quick to teach about a disability, a specific disability of a student. But how often are we really teaching about just accommodations that students provide and how they remove a barrier, right? It's not about advantage. It's about removing the barrier, right? It's about the access that a student needs. But then in that providing that access, there's that I'm outed as a student with an accommodation because of the way the access is provided, right? It becomes this double-edged sword, that's not helpful, right? Right, in universal design, exactly, right? Like that could be absolutely something that could be wonderful if more people would use it, right? If more more people actually did it, that would be wonderful. So when we think about, Marco, right, the emotionally intelligent gesture, right, the simplest thing to do that you all have already said, right, you encourage him to meet with accessibility services, right? You kind of tell him that tips about how accommodations college don't have to out him and ways that he can do things, utilize a pen that records instead of an actual recording device, or there are other ways to provide accommodations where it doesn't look like there's an issue, right? There are ways to do it, right? Um, to not out him to the professors. Someone said, this is the office I work in. We are working to retool our language of accommodation so everyone understands the what and the why. Yes, yes, right? That absolutely matters, right? We have to understand the what and the why about accommodations, right? We have to really get to this idea that it's not just the the student is not the problem, right? Oftentimes it's really the way things are being taught. And so we think about practical steps in this idea of emotional intelligence and this idea of removing stigma and this idea, what can we do? The reality is that it's simple, right? We need to reevaluate and self-evaluate, recognize, right? What are our own personal biases that may exist? Is there implicit bias that may be going on, right? What is your EI? Have you taken an assessment, right? When it comes to emotional self-awareness and or social responsibility, right? Have you taken a mental health first aid class to learn about stigma? Have you taken an EI assessment to learn more about how to combat it and where you stand with how you are on these scales, right? Understanding yourself, right? This is something that I think the first, if you came to the opening session, she talked a lot about being able to understand who you are and understanding your biases so that you can be better in this idea of inclusiveness, right? Um, Remembering that we need to focus on accommodations that remove the barriers and not us, not the disability, right? It's the structures that are the problem, not the individual with the disability. And we really have to stop always putting that idea that it's the person that is the issue, right? It's the structures that are the problem. We don't walk into a building and if the automatic door doesn't work, we blame the person who can't get through the automatic door. No one does that, right? And so we have to start thinking this way with other types of disabilities, right? Um, Teach, encourage, be inclusive, right? Understanding that accommodations are not the advantage, right? Right. These are all really practical, simple things that we can do to really get to this idea of how we reduce this accessibility stigma, right? um, Equal access to education, right? Absolutely, right? Access, right? That in higher ed, right? We're talking about access, right? Now, don't get me wrong, K through 12 is success, and it can be beautiful when it's done correctly, right? Um, but in higher ed, our focus oftentimes is access. And so, how do we make sure that we're really truly providing access? How do we make sure that we're teaching our faculty and staff about accommodations? How do we make sure that we're shutting down these negative stigmatizing thoughts, negative stigmatizing ideas that come out of just hearing the word disability, right? I was reading another article the other day, and it's saying, disability is not a dirty word, right? People have been trying to change this word disability, right? But this is a debate within the disability community, right? That, some people are just not okay with it and some people are, right? That this is who I am and you can't take that identity away from me just because you don't like the word disability, right? And then there are individuals with disability that hate that word, and they're like, no, and they push it away and they say, no, I'm not, you're not gonna put that word on me. But and why is that though, right? The reason that they feel that way is because of the stigma that people have put on that word, right? And so this is what we have to try to do. How can we combat this idea of stigma, right? We really have to understand who we are as individuals to do this work, right? So when we think about stigma in EI, right? If I'm aware of how I may stigmatize the topic of students with disabilities, then I'm displaying emotional self-awareness, right? How am I aware? What are the questions that I ask myself? What are the things that I say to myself? What are the things that I say to others in conversation, right? How do I talk about this topic with other people, right? What is your emotional awareness around the idea of stigma in students with disabilities? And when you put those two concepts together, right? And then if I can be socially responsible and consider the welfare of Marco or anyone else with a disability in my community, right? Then I'm being socially responsible, right? Then I'm using my emotional intelligence to combat the stigma to help Marco or anybody else with a disability, right? So we can utilize these concepts, right, of emotional intelligence to really bring it home to stop this idea of stigma that surrounds this topic, right? Like this is possible, right? What are the things that we're saying about accommodation? What are the things that we're doing that's impacting how we think and move and be, right? Um, are we aware of those things? Are there implicit biases that may be in the way, right? So this brings us to this idea of the three words, right, that you wrote down. I want you to think about those three words that you wrote down in this previous activity, right, that we did, right? What emotions to the three words that you wrote down bring up for you? And then think about why those emotions come up for you with those three words, right? Um, Please feel free to share if you feel like you want to share. If there's something that you feel like you want to bring it up, it's up to you. It's your personalized journey in this. If something you want to say, but whether the terms are quote unquote good or bad, right? Stigmatizing or not, right? Be honest with yourself, right? You don't have to share. Please feel free. I would love to hear some of your thoughts, but you don't have to share. I just want you to be honest with yourself, right? And exactly where you feel like you stand in this thought. So, whatever the three words you wrote down, right? Think about the emotions that are attached to them: sadness, pity, shame, mm, mm, because it could hurt someone else, even if it's not the intent. Oh, mm, right. That's a, that's a, that's real, right? Uncomfortable, right? Wow, right? Mm. And that's that. Thankfully, it's not me. That brings up a point. I was something else I was reading. Right, reading is fundamental. I love it. I was reading. I was reading another article, and it was about how we often do these exercises with accessibility, and we to try to simulate a disability, right? And so, oh, I'm gonna um, treat as though I'm blind and I'm gonna go to a grocery store, or I'm gonna sit in a wheelchair and I'm gonna try to cross the street, right? We do these exercises for disability and to try to give this empathy for individuals with a disability. But the reality is that what it does, it does these things right here. It creates that, oh, I'm so glad this isn't me, right? But that's not what the disability community wants you to feel about them, right? The disability community doesn't want you to feel shame for how they experience and go through life, right? They don't want you to feel sorry for them, right? That's not the goal, right? And so in that activity, that's not the goal, but that's what happens, right? Oftentimes that's what happens. And so we have to be careful at how even activities like that can provide that stigma, just add to the stigma that's associated with this disability, that's associated with the word disability, right? I love challenged but not defeated, right? Um, be, and so think about this, right? That what words are we using and how can we really fix these words to be less stigmatizing? Is there language we could use so we're not as stigmatizing? Do we use a first person type of language, right? Do we put the person first and not the disability, right? What are we saying? What are the things that we're doing, right? That the words that came up for us when we think about the word disability end up being something that is sad or uncomfortable, right? And how can we fix that? What are the things, right? We have to think about that and how we really like promote this idea in our worlds, in our spheres, and how we operate and how we move. And so um, while we got done way earlier than I anticipated, and that was possibly conversation and small interaction, it's something I want to end with, right? I really want you to think about this. Enjoy your weekend, but consider this idea of how we want to reframe, how you want to reframe how you think about accessibility stigma, disability stigma, and how you can combat that with your own emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and the things that you feel like that you can do to change that, to combat that, to be better at that. Thank you guys. I appreciate you coming. You guys got out early. I didn't even anticipate it. I thank you for attending my session today. I hope you learned something. I appreciate it. Differences are an opportunity to be better and more inclusive. Yes, yes. Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Hey,
Were there
so
any questions? I'm sorry.
let me see if I see any for you, but can I make a statement? There's a reason
Yes.
I came to this session. So
There was a
I'm
what?
going to, I said, there's a reason I came to this session. If you don't mind me making a statement, I know we got a little bit of time and people don't mind
Yeah.
listening. So in grammar school, I was diagnosed with a disability. So I have a learning disability, right? Master's degree, 2 master's degrees and everything. And
Yes.
eventually I, in high school, was given the option, like, do you want to stay? Do you want to, do you want to stay in the program? Do you want to get out? And I was like, well, I'm in high school. I'm like, I want to get out of this program because I felt like, I'm just gonna say it. I felt like I was embarrassed that I had I was embarrassed that I had a disability. Right? I didn't want any of my friends to know. I didn't want my student. I didn't want nobody to know because I was like, I am like an eyeball, right? Like I just am. I don't want anybody to know. I'm embarrassed. I had to go to like special classes sometimes.
Yeah.
So embarrassing. So I was like, well, my senior year I got out. Of course, the older I am now, I'm like, man, I wish I would have stayed in when I went to college, because part of my learning disability is that I don't remember things well. But then I thought about what that one thing that you had, and I was like, man, if just to know the benefits, like if I could have even just knew the benefits of like extra test time, right? The extra help. I mean, even as an adult, I didn't even know. And like I said, I've had 2 master's degrees and wish I would have known then, right? Like, so I feel like I wouldn't have struggled as much. But then, I think about it, I'm like, man, but if you do get out, like, how do you know who to even go to? Like, you see, like in class, let's say, you go to Office of Disabilities, right? But what if you're taking yourself out? There is no IEP anymore, right? Now you have no IEP because you got out the program,
Right.
And I think even as an adult, it took me a long time to tell my husband I had a disability.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
even as an adult, it's almost like that stigma still I have, like, of being a child, right? Like being young and like, I don't want people to know.
Yeah.
I just don't want people to know. So
Yeah.
I just want to thank you for this amazing session. And thanks for anybody that stuck around and listened to my little story, my personal life.
No,
Uh,
I love it. I love it. It absolutely adds to the richness of the conversation. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
yeah,
It does. And that's the thing, that's the problem, right? Is that people aren't willing to talk. We aren't willing to have these conversations. And that's the problem. We need to start having more conversation, right? And when we can really start to talk more about it, we start to open up, we start to learn, we learn from each other. It reduces the stigma of everything, right? So it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I love that.
no problem. Let me see. I'm just looking. I didn't know if anybody else was having more questions. So you're welcome, Tracy. So let me just say, oh, Kathy said medical providers can help. Well, y'all can see the chat. I don't
Oh
know why
yeah.
I'm reading it like.
Yeah. Got you.
So I just really want to say to everyone, thank you. There's some more stuff popping up in chat too. So thank
Yeah, yeah.
you for attending. I have a slide I was going to show.
Oh, let me stop.
Let me hide some of these things I forgot. It's not. All right. So this, as y'all know, is our last session of the day. So I just wanted to say thank you all so much for attending this year's conference. And definitely want to give a very special thank you to all of our guests and our speakers and everybody that supported us, y'all. It takes a lot. I don't know if y'all have ever put on a conference or been a part of putting on a conference. It takes a lot of work. And so I actually was responsible for the conference this year and last year in the first year. But I definitely will say, you guys, make sure that you take the information you've learned from this conference and apply it. At least apply one thing you've learned from each session. So I just want to say again, thank you for coming and attending, and we look forward to seeing everybody at next year's conference. You never know, Demetria might show back up next year and present again. All right, you guys. Again, I want to just thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your evening because I'm going to probably go to sleep.
Get some rest.